I have a fun guest, I think. I think it's going to be a great conversation. David Krae. And I've asked him to come and talk to me because I follow him on Twitter and I noticed that he talks about things and thinks about things in a similar way to me, in that he doesn't look at things from the top down in the political sense. He's looking much more from the bottom up at our, each of our roles and things, and is much more talking about philosophy and concepts like authoritarianism and where people are on that sort of authoritarian spectrum, rather than saying left or right or Republican or Democrat. Just how much do you want to be in other people's business, right? And also, he's very interested in history, philosophy, the Constitution, privacy, surveillance, all these things that I'm interested in. So I've followed him for a long time and like a lot of his takes. And I thought, I'm going to talk to that guy. We had a preliminary conversation yesterday to plan for this recording and discovered something interesting. We're both Generation X, but we're kind of bookends. I'm at the very beginning in 1966, and he's more towards the end of Gen X. And yet we had some similar experiences. And I think it may have shaped how we look at what's going on right now in the culture. And I just thought it would be fun to talk through some of that. So welcome, David. Thank you for joining me. And how are you today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, no, we had an interesting chat yesterday. We probably should hit record on some of that as well.
I know, right?
But that's okay. We can recover some of that. One of the things you mentioned about culture. We'll start with that being like sort of a bottom up kind of thing. Is I see culture as my background is as a writer. A filmmaker, sometimes actor too, even sometimes musician, but that's more on the fun side.
I should have mentioned that. That was like all okay. Supposed to be in my intro.
That's all right.
And I'm busy going, he's interested in this and interested in that. And I totally forgot that what you do.
Well, that's okay. We're here to talk about ideas. And that's a lot of people do many different things, have worn many hats. I mean, anybody in the arts and entertainment business has probably done other things along the way, because you don't start off at the top, like a lot of. So, I've had a couple. I guess I've had a couple different mini careers in different spheres. Not all of them entertainment. I've worked in advertising as well, and like we talked about earlier, I did briefly work overseas and doing a bit of government work once upon a time, and but anyway, back to with regards to culture. One of the issues that I kind of think is an issue or is a problem today that we're seeing a lot of sort of waves on is this question of creative expression and free expression, or free, people say, oh, freedom of speech, but there's also artistic expression involved with that, right? And I think people recently would have seen the notice from Netflix saying that to a lot of their employees, saying, look, you're going to have to work on content that you might not agree with politically, based on your political views or your ideologies. Like, look, we believe in, I think they said something, look, free expression, creative freedom. And from my perspective, as a writer, as a filmmaker, and as somebody who's trained as an actor, one of the things for me, I think the difference is between art and what I call propaganda, is whether your expression is free, whether it's natural, it's coming up from you, the individual, or the people. They talk about the grassroots, right? And that's culture. That's where culture comes from. It's a thing that's alive. It's evolving. It's a product of many cultures blending together. All the cultures we have today are the product of previous cultures that came before, right? Like bits and pieces of it, and then being expressed in new ways to a large degree. But we have this politics, this kind of, I guess it's an ideology now that's kind of become in vogue over the last few decades. I remember when sort of a lot of the rhetoric started becoming really popular in the 1990s when I was a student in the early 90s. And that has kind of become an ideology that's they talk about cultural appropriation, and they say, well, you shouldn't write about this. I mean, from a writer's perspective, at first they were saying,
Right.
you should write things that are inclusive, that include everybody, and that shows diversity. I'm like, great, let's do that. And then and all of a sudden now they're like, you're not allowed to write about this, that, and the other thing because you don't represent those groups. And you're like, well, which is it, right? So,
and then you turn on Bridgerton,
yeah,
and you know, and it's and I mean, or you know, suddenly Ariel is going to be black, and the thing is, like, but to your point, as far as artistic expression, like most people in America probably really wouldn't care
yeah,
about how you're casting these things. And we traditionally haven't. It's been like pretty diverse for a long, long time. It's not brand new.
yeah. It's
But I
been
think when
decades now that
you
people do not
add
much
the
of it.
component of the finger wagging, don't you dare culturally appropriate, it sort of
right,
acts as a triggering mechanism for people to start noticing the hypocrisy that you just pointed out. And it's not that they're annoyed that Ariel is going to be black. It's that they're annoyed at the hypocrisy or the lack of consistency in the message. I think.
well, that's
at
it,
least.
right? Like, I mean, you know, I've long been a proponent of open casting and diverse casting. I mean, going back now, 2002, maybe 2003, I pitched, and we got it greenlit. It was a short project. A friend of mine had auditioned to a Shakespeare festival, a rather prestigious one, and she was Asian and had been kind of turned away because they were a little bit. I think they were being a little bit racist, and I got annoyed by that. I said, well, why shouldn't you be able to play any character, right? In fact, they could do. I mean, they can not only do modern day interpretations, right? You could take a Shakespearean play and set it in New York City and have different people be from different neighborhoods, right? Like Romeo and Juliet, instead of Montagues and Capulets, they're from this neighborhood and that neighborhood, and maybe they're different.
West Side Story is pretty much what that is, right? Yeah.
Right. So, I thought, well, why not do it was a short film of all these different people of all these different backgrounds and ethnicities, and identities, and this is 20 years ago now. Each of them saying, you know, the famous speech from Hamlet, right? The to be or not to be,
right?
Question, you know, like,
that is the question, right?
Yeah, and then do fast cuts between all of them, and so that all of them on their acting resume could say that they played the Dane. So I thought that would be kind of fun, but no, I mean, so, you know, diversity in casting and all that, that's fine. I mean, that's great. But then you're right. Then there was this additional layer that's been added to things in more recent years, where it's this stay in your lane and everything has to be representation of some group. And you're like, this is no longer free. This is no longer creative. This is no longer creativity. This is now it's feeling more like propaganda. It's been politicized so much that you can't just, and part of creative freedom is being able to play, right? They talk about actors, and it sounds maybe a little immature, but when you sit down to write something, when you, like a musician, they sit down and they just start playing and getting a vibe going. And yeah, there's much more, there's craft to writing and to acting and to performance and to directing, and there's composition involved, yes, but there's also creative freedom, and that has to exist within your psyche. And when you're constantly on eggshells, when you're constantly trying to police yourself for, well, we can't say that this way, and we're not allowed to talk about that,
or we have to say it this way. Like, I was watching a network show that I watch now. I watch it on Hulu because I can't stand commercials, but I was catching up for a couple episodes, and I love the show. It's a great show. I think it's a well-written show. But there was a scene in the most recent episode that I just felt was so contrived. So that I felt, you know, the have to say or have to throw something in. And I thought to myself, you know, it's not that it bothers me. It's not that the subject matter annoys me. Basically, you had a female FBI agent and a trainee FBI agent, also female, and they're riding in a car together. And one is talking about how to the trainee about how, you know, this is a hard job and you probably don't want it. We're not having had a relationship last more than I'm into one night stands and all this. And then she has to throw in my last girlfriend. So now we know she's a lesbian. Okay, fine. Who cares? But it was kind of the way she said it was less contrived than what the trainee said next. And she then says, oh, but are they good? Meaning, like, was the sex good? And this is a network TV show, right, on primetime. And the woman kind of made a face and she goes, all right then. And she goes, well, my last boyfriend broke up with me because I sometimes have girlfriends. And my last girlfriend broke up with me because I joined the FBI and she's in, defund the police or whatever. And the whole exchange just felt so fake. It felt like this conversation would never happen. This felt like somebody in the writer's desk sat down and said, let's somehow work in bisexuality to the conversation with the lesbian, with the trainee, with the, and on top of it, she was Black, so that we have all this going on. And it took away from what was otherwise a really good episode. And like I said, it's not that subject matter. I couldn't care less who you sleep with, what you do. That's irrelevant. It's the entertainment was compromised by me having to deal with this contrived dialogue that just was it felt obviously designed to make the audience aware of something or like kind of drive home some point and represent and all this. And I'm sorry, they can't deny it anymore. When you're using language like representative and diversity, equity, and inclusion, you don't get away with saying, no, that was totally authentic. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was totally natural. Do you remember after school specials?
Yes.
Okay, right. So after school specials for the younger folks following along, they were the after school, they were a TV special, an hour or two, like little mini movies that were on, and they always had some message, and it was they lay it on real thick, and it was so fake and so corny, and everyone just made fun of these things, and they weren't bad stories, but they were just badly done, like just really obvious, like be safe, right? Like a lot of the crap and the slogans and to me, a lot of that dialogue that you're describing sounds it echoes those corny, fake, lame ass after school specials
and these are the people who can't stop using the word authentic.
Yeah,
they're authentic selves and they're authentic this or authentic that. I'm like,
and it's fake.
Literally everything about you and your whatever this thing is that you're doing, some woke, political correctness on steroids, like whatever you want to call it, is inauthentic. It's contrived to push a specific message or narrative, which is, as near as I can tell, like, don't be normal. With normal being anything remotely traditional, anything mainstream, anything that is just, I don't know.
Well, and
they even had the word basic in our kids' vocabulary. Oh, they're so basic.
Well, anything that normies. Isn't calculated too, right? So much of, again, it's all political, right? And there's this idea that we're seeing more and more that they're politicizing everything. This sort of cultural movement, and it's in education. It's not just in politics. It's in media. It's in news media. It's in arts and cultural media, and it's in education too. It's in the schools, and it's horribly, for lack of a better word, it's lame. And maybe that's ageist to call it, or not ageist.
That's our
ableist.
Gen X word. It's lame.
Ableist language to call it, but I don't care. It's lame. It's so lame because it comes across as fake. So much of it. So, and like you said, contrived, and that's an excellent word. Here's something interesting from the sort of acting world, directing world. When you're one thing I noticed fairly early on directing actors in film, where you'll do the same scene and you'll do multiple takes, so you'll all right, action, the actors do their acting, cut, all right, and always, almost all the time, the take that the actor thought they did the best, they were like, yeah, that was the one, I nailed that scene. It was terrible. It's not their best take usually. The ones that they had no idea what they just did, when they can't even remember, they're like, I have no idea what I just did. That was where they were truly, it came alive, because they weren't thinking about it. And this is a term we have called being in your head, right? As you're not being the character, you're thinking about being the character. And this to me is the difference between what is natural performance versus what is fake. And when an actor is aware of what they're doing, when they're fully, they're not engaged, they're not in the moment, they're not free, is when they come across as fake. And so much of this stuff comes across as fake.
So when you see like the TikTok kids and the TikTok teachers and all these little videos of people modeling their persona, you know, and their identities and all this stuff, are you looking at it that way? Like, do you look at it and read it similarly?
I try to, well, a lot of this stuff is autobiographical, right? So it's not performance, it's not narrative drama. So that, whereas narrative drama, when you're watching like a TV series or a movie, that's narrative drama, and a lot of these scenes, like the one you described, they come across as fake because the writers are injecting politics into there. Now, when some kid on TikTok or some person on TikTok wants to rant about whatever it is that's important to them, about their I don't know, you know, what
their pronouns or something.
Their pronouns or what being non-binary means to them. Fine, that's just them sort of autobiographically speaking about the thing. So a lot of them actually come across as authentic because they truly believe what they're saying, and it's not contrived. Especially, I find a lot of the sort of younger ones. Some of the older ones, that like some teachers on there, they're like, now we're going to talk about the thing that's really important to me because this is my politics and blah, blah, blah. And you're like, you know, like it's you know, as corny as I don't know.
But you get to read that the kids are that's they believe it. That's real for them.
Yeah, because that's what they've been told. These are the words that they've been fed, and this is the language that they learned, right? And it's really important to them right now. But you remember, like, yeah, maybe we're you know, getting a little, we're grown-ups now, but not so far away from our youth that we don't remember how important everything was back then. I mean, when you're a teenager and also college kid into your 20s, everything's so important, right? Like,
yeah, there's an intensity to your definition of yourself.
Yeah,
you take yourself very seriously. I mean, I remember, I don't know about you, but I didn't start dialing that back and not taking myself very seriously till I was close to 30. Like it was just like alarmingly late that I still was like very concerned with how how I was packaging myself for the outside world's sort of consumption. And we were talking yesterday about that. We were talking about, how things were when we were kids, and how they were different as far as how we, like the experiences that we had and the perspective that we had were radically different than kids today. However, one thing that was similar was that we did have identity markers. And, it's not talked about a lot, right? Like, I don't know what you were in high school, but I was kind of like, I was a tomboy. I was somewhere between like a jock and a nerd. But I hung out with the theater kids in high school because I did like props and costumes and stuff. But I really, my core identity was like soccer player, nerdy student with her hand always in the air. Like I was the kid and that everybody rolled their eyes when I raised my hand, and the teacher would be like, somebody besides filming, it was like that. I wore it like a costume. Like I was aware of it. I was acutely aware of it. And I leaned into it. I remember that because I couldn't be the other things. Like I wasn't ever going to be the princess. I wasn't ever going to be, the girl that everybody wanted to be friends with. I wasn't ever going to be like a punk. And I remember thinking about that. And this is what's so funny is each group of kids thinks the other one is conforming and they're not.
Oh, yeah,
so I remember looking at like the punk kids who had like the black combat boots and the long coats and whatever, the Judd Nelson wannabes of both sexes. And we're thinking, you think you're so counterculture, but you're really conformist. There I was in my little polo shirt flipped up or whatever. But we had that. And we act like today that these kids aligning themselves with these different identities, that it's so new. It's like, no, that we had that too in Gen X.
Yeah. And
at least I think so.
Millennials had their emos and their cutters. I mean, Gen X we had our goths and our punks and our the jocks and the
stoners,
the stoners and the skaters,
the preppies.
The preppies. Yeah. So like there were the different cliques, right? And in the groups now, of course, they've got I don't know. I don't know what they have now, but certainly I got a zillion different labels, right?
Yes.
And that seems to be something different. And a lot of it
That's
like,
true. We didn't walk around going, "Hi, I'm Deb. I'm a nerdy tomboy jock girl." Like,
yeah,
we
like,
didn't do
hello,
that.
my name is, and here are
Yeah,
my
we didn't do
pronouns.
that.
Like, we didn't do pronouns. We didn't label ourselves. We just
No.
knew who we were based on who we hung
Yeah.
out with, right?
Well,
Like,
and it was more geared towards like our hobbies and our interests and which other kids we felt most comfortable around.
yeah,
So we definitely did seem to be looking for groups or looking for something to attach to as far as peer groups, rather than just just floating individuals. So I guess my point is we often talk about ourselves now that we're adults as like, well,
yeah,
we were super independent because we were latchkey kids, right? But and we were
yeah.
independent in the I can make my own food and do my own laundry and open the door and go in the house alone and stuff like that and be out till dark. But I don't know that we were socially any more independent than anybody today. Not sure.
No, probably not. I mean, when you're trying to, and this is, I think, one of the issues that I have with what's going on now in culture and education and media is, um, when you're that age, you're trying to figure yourself out, right? You're
Yeah.
trying to figure out who am I, what makes me tick. Like you said, you didn't quite fully kind of let go a lot of that sort of until you were almost 30, right? It's a long
Yeah.
process to kind of become a grown up, right? To go from being a kid to
Yep.
hitting that horrible puberty and all the awkward weirdness of that and the confusion of that, right? And I think that's a big
Yep.
part of it, is that we're not acknowledging that there's that confusion that kids have in their late grade school into middle school and into high school, that whenever the changes start happening,
Yep.
right, that there's confusion, and that's okay, and that's normal, and you should have that because you haven't figured it out yet. Instead, there seems to be this idea that, well, we have to, like, teachers and sort of these culture warriors want to pounce on kids and like, here's your identities and we're going to give you all the, and you're like, well, just what is that? Hey, teachers, leave them kids alone, right?
Right. Well, we talked about this. I've sort of this working theory around that, in the sense that when we were kids, those of us who were sort of latchkey, or even if we weren't latchkey, our parents we were the first generation that really had the two income family, that was very
Yeah,
widespread, or divorced. So, when I was in grade school, like, nobody's parents were divorced that I knew.
yeah,
Then by the time I got to middle school, it was like they started dropping like flies. And I remember thinking this, because my family was like one of the first ones to get divorced, and like amongst my friends group, and I was horrified. I was like, even though I couldn't stand my mom and she was terribly abusive, and I say it on the channel all the time, like, part of me was like, don't let the door hit you on the way out. But it was still socially really weird to be the one kid in your friend group that, like, your mom wasn't there at all. Like,
right.
my friends didn't know my mom was a jerk, not until later. But then by middle school, high school, it was like every other kid, divorce was common. And what I wonder is, those of us who grew up that way, when we had to go through puberty basically alone, like, nobody was sitting us down and saying, all right, let's have a chat, right? We got it from like Judy Bloom, and then later Judith Krantz. And,
And
maybe
flowers
once
in the attic.
HB,
No.
there, that too. And then, oh my God, VC Andrews. And then of course, HBO became a thing. And
Sure.
MTV, we were the MTV generation.
Yeah.
So you started like seeing stuff around, right? And I wonder if then we grew up and we had kids. And so a lot of us who have kids, or the millennials even who came after us, we didn't have great role models saying, like, when your child hits puberty, this is what you should have. Like, we don't have a memory of that. We got it from everywhere else.
Do you remember how scandalous it was when Cyndi Lauper came out with She Bop?
Yes.
Which was a euphemism for self-pleasuring, right?
Yes.
But like,
I remember.
how scandalous to talk about that. And now look at what everybody's talking about these days.
They're talking about it in school. And
Oh, I
so,
know.
but I mean, I've encountered so many parents who, and
Wow.
first of all, you get the teachers doing it who are like, but we have to, they have a right to this education, as if parents won't do it. And I keep waiting for the parents to say, hey guys, are you going to speak up and say, we were going to do that? We're doing it. What are you talking about? We're not doing it. But I've met a lot of parents who go, well, I want to have that conversation. I'm not, what?
Right.
That's
so
fine. Let
a lot
the
of them
teachers
want
do
to
it.
abdicate to the education system, right?
They didn't have it themselves.
right?
I think to a large number of people, maybe who were Gen X or then millennials, because Gen X didn't know, it was like blind leading the blind, that they were accustomed already to the rest of the world educating my child about growing up, about getting from age like 10 to 18. It's like, you're at the school, I'm at work, I'm doing the 9 to 5 thing, whatever. And, it's like, my job is to put the roof over your head, send you to summer camp, buy you nice things, get you a cell phone, get you blah, 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 and make sure you go to college. And then the nitty gritty was kind of like, it was outsourced for us. I won't say it was like literally done, but it ended up being. And I think people think it's normal. Like, it's a rite of passage to learn sex ed at school, isn't it?
And you know what? And that wouldn't even be such a horrible thing if it was just, here are the mechanics, here are the basics, here's what you need to know.
Exactly.
At a puberty or age appropriate time, right? And if you want to know more, if you need more information or you're confused about anything, go see the guidance counselor who's maybe more trained than the 5th grade English teacher, or whatever.
Right.
Like, if they made those resources available but said, here's the basics. Instead, there's like a whole pile of stuff that they're kind of putting on the kids' minds. And you're like, wait a second. Like, first of all, they seem to want to do it really young. And I know this is very controversial right now as a topic, but it's like before kids have even sort of awakened to that aspect of life. Right.
At a point where it might even be scary for them because they're like really not. And I actually think that especially like some of the millennial parents are more attentive than our parents were. And so I think that plus other factors, there's a little more what you might call like helicopter parenting, a little more worry about stranger danger and all these things that we had. Ironically, we were more in danger of being picked up in a panel van than their kids are today. Yeah. And yet we were out till dark. But I think the kids today actually are ironically a little more innocent than we were at the younger age. So I think it's even more detrimental. But I wonder if the parents assume that the sex ed is like what we had, which was more about the mechanics and drug use, lots of stuff about drug use. Right.
Yeah.
And even I remember they did a fair amount of scaring the living daylights out of us about getting pregnant in terms of this is how terrifying it is to have a baby. Like there was the whole here, take the baby home and keep it alive exercise that some people had to do in high school.
Remember the Tamagotchi?
Yes. And then there were those. So, I mean, there were things that were people are like, oh, no. And they haven't caught up with it. But the second part of my theory is that it's members of our generation who had crap parents. Really. Like, I mean, or just, not crap. They maybe do the best they could, but they just weren't really attentive. Okay. They weren't around. Who are now those educators who I see so much projection going on at the upper levels of education. I'm not talking the 23-year-old student who's been brainwashed in college. I'm talking about the person who's, in their 40s and 50s. They have, master's and PhD. They are educators. Okay. They are developing programs like, the advocacy for youth and Amaze and things like that with these comprehensive sex ed stuff. And they're developing all the entertainment for Nickelodeon that's geared towards youth. They're our age. Okay. There are some millennials obviously too.
And but some older too. A lot of this activism is younger boomers born in the 50s too.
Yeah. But I just wonder if there's some projection going into this based on their absentee parents. Like there's so much when you listen to them talk like, well, parents aren't around and parents don't do this and parents do that. Like, are you talking from your own personal experience, or are you actually referencing some kind of hard data that you have?
Well, does anybody do social research anymore? I mean, I got a little bit of trouble a while ago on Twitter. Oh no. Well, there was this sociologist that I was kind of toying with a little bit. I was criticizing him for, he was really into like qualitative research. He's a social justice academic. And as a sociologist, I said, well, aren't the social sciences called social sciences because they were going to apply the scientific method to social research, like rigor, gathering wide data sets, like doing actual work, like actual research. And this was offensive.
It's so white of you, David.
Well,
okay. Actual objective science is the Smithsonian told me so. Sorry.
Well, I saw that the Smith. That
was
right? their infographic, and that was, if you look at the bottom of that, and I have a screenshot of all that stuff. I saved that, and it's from Judith Katz, 1990. Was when that was the material that those infographics, which were so racist, and people complained and they pulled it. It was the Smithsonian's African
the African American history component of their
and people were just like, what, this is crazy, right? No, this sociologist got a little upset with me, and invented this and said, oh well, these people who demand that the social scientists actually gather data, they're engaging in excuse me, scientific fascism was it's a term that he invented, right? And the guy
That's right, if there was health equity.
Well, he posted
climate
an article
equity
on Medium, and posted screenshots of my tweets, non-anonymized, with my face and name on it. This is an example of scientific fascism. And I'm like, I got a little mad at him for that, and we had a little thing on. We had it out.
Oh my god,
and
scientific fascism. That's wild.
So he tried to make me the poster child for this thing, and I thought that was pretty offensive. So he did eventually relent and anonymize it. I mean, it's still there. He still kept my, but I kind of laugh. I'm like, if you read this, it's just basically me saying, come on, buddy, like, do some actual research. And I think that's part of it. Is a lot of the stuff that we're seeing going on right now, the data that they're pulling from is a lot of it's from the 1970s and 80s, right? They're reading authors and studies and famous thinkers from in these sort of activist movements, who are writing from a perspective of a world that no longer exists, first of all, right? And like you said, they're projecting their own, or not even their own, they're projecting the perspective of someone they read who who is writing from a perspective 60 years ago, right? Right? Like how long ago was the 1950s and 60s, right?
Right. Well, that's it. And they really, it's weird. I feel like they're living in some kind of time warp, where I read some of the stuff and I'm like, did you go into a coma at a certain point and then like wake up and you just forgot everything? Because the other thing that you and I talked about yesterday, we talked about being very aware, both as children and young adults, about the Soviet Union, its existence, its impact, the difference between it and its policies and the United States. And then I think most importantly, you pointed out coming into contact with people towards the end, at or after the fall of the Soviet Union, where, the first generation, the generation that kind of had like grown up with those policies and what they were most concerned of. Tell us more about that, because I think that is really interesting what you just said about projection. And it's like, they're in this different time. That's the one that really drives me crazy about people today. They're forgetting this whole thing.
Yeah. Well, part of it is, I think that when the Cold War ended, right, and arguably 89 to 90 in the early 90s, as the fall of the Berlin Wall, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and at the end of the day, the end of the Cold War. And there was this collective sigh of relief that, first of all, we weren't all going to be dying a horrible fiery death of nuclear annihilation, right? Like, that was, I don't know if that was your childhood nightmare, but that was mine.
No, I mean, for sure. They were doing duck and cover drills in my elementary school.
So
like, I'm sure my little desk is going to save my life from nuclear.
Yes. So you're growing up thinking, so at any moment, at any time, we could all just get the entire surface of planet Earth could be roasted. What was it, like 100 times they had enough nukes for, or something like that?
Yeah.
So that ended, and everyone's like, oh, thank goodness. and communism is over, right? And that was, I think, this mistake, this idea, well, it failed, it's over, the threat is gone, and we can get on with life now. Right. And then we had 10 years of relative whatever, not a whole lot of no major enemy, and then boom, the war on terror, right? 9/11 happened. But so then, of course, it all became about Middle Eastern terrorism and all this other stuff, but we forgot about the ideology, those ideologies. And this, to the point you were talking about, in between my sojourns in the film, I was sneaking off campus to go work in film production when I was a student, and then ended up working overseas for the government. Family pressures. They wanted me to go into something a little more respectable than entertainment, especially back then. So I kind of humored them a little bit, and I did some overseas work for the government, and we talked about that a little bit yesterday. Working, and it was mainly in working in post-communist transition, helping in different ways with these sort of former Soviet and Eastern Bloc countries, who these are entire generations, no one living alive who hadn't grown up under the one-party communist system. Right, so they had no idea how to do democracy or capitalism or free markets, and so there were so that was a big component of the project that I first.
But you mentioned something about surveillance. You said that where they felt the worst.
Yeah,
like it was kind of like it was not so much the freedom to do the commerce part, but it was just the freedom from looking over their shoulder every 2 seconds.
When I first got there, I mean, I went over obviously with my own ideas, and I had studied Russian Soviet foreign policy and the history of the rise of authoritarianism, fascism in Germany and communism in Russia and China, and had a lot of ideas about that. But I was surprised that when you're over there, you're meeting people, you're working with. I ended up teaching at university for a while there, and I taught a class. I was a master's students, international relations, and it was interesting to talk to them. And these were kids who they had grown up under communism, but now they were no longer living in that world, and they had a hard time, even forget coming up with a thesis, but actually picking their own essay topics, because their whole life they've been told what to write. And this is what's interesting is I finally called them. I said, guys, what's going on? Like you're dragging your heels on this. And they said, well, can't you just tell us what to write? And I said, what do you mean? They said, well, look, if we write or we say the wrong thing,
right,
then it could be held against us. Like it would stop us from getting into our PhD programs, or maybe like prevent us from getting that job we want. And if you just tell us what you want us to write, then if we get in trouble for it later, we can just blame you. And that was the surprise. Is I thought and a lot of people I talked to had that as their issue in different ways. The economic system, the communist economic system sucked. It was lacked incentives. It had its issues, but it was the mass surveillance that really stuck with people, and I kind of had this fear that was really deep in them. That they were constantly being judged, that they were being surveilled, that they were going to be looked at, and then anything they ever did could be held against them at any time. And of course
they hated it, right? They hated it.
And it just stifled them, and it stagnated them. And I think I like to say that I know everybody likes to say America won the Cold War, right? But I don't think that's true. I think what happened was Russia lost the Cold War. Or not Russia, the Soviet Union lost the Cold War more than anything, because basically the whole system collapsed, right? It wasn't like the Cold War was a non-war. It was just a standoff with some proxies, and then one side just crumbled and the other side was left standing, therefore they won. And part of that stagnancy, that disintegration from within, is that the destruction of the human spirit, because people didn't care, right? By the end of it, a lot of people just didn't care. And you could look around, and this was again in the 1990s when things were still fresh. Mm-hmm. You could look at all the stuff that was built during the Soviet era. A lot of it was just garbage. It was crumbling. Mm-hmm. You could tell that nobody cared for decades. And because they were all afraid, because if you actually cared, if you actually tried to achieve, you tried to do anything interesting or good or of any kind of quality, right, with any kind of merit, you were considered. It was like you're sticking your neck out, you're sticking your head up. You're right. People everyone around you would resent you for then making them look bad, right? So there's this culture of again, it all comes back to the fact that they feel like they're being watched, tracked, and we're moving there. And that's the sad thing, is I think we're I told them, look, guys, you're free now. You have democracy. You don't have to worry about this stuff anymore. Like, if you're going to have a democracy, if you're going to have a free country, you're going to have to be willing to debate things and be wrong about things and figure it out, make mistakes and learn from them and continue growing, right? That's the adaptability of sort of the modern Western political system and all its various structures. There's all these checks and balances and it's a bit messy, but that's kind of by design. Well, now here we are, they're making a liar out of me because we're now installing these same kind of cultural ideas of like, let's put everybody under surveillance. Let's track everything you said. And that thing you said 10 years ago, we're going to cancel your job tomorrow because of the mistake you made, because you made a bad joke. What? Like it's
well,
really...
you've probably seen those videos with Yuri Bezmenov, who defected to Canada, and then he made these videos, and he mentioned the program to demoralize the United States, and by I think it was 1980, he said, well, it's done, the project is pretty much complete, and he was commenting on some of the things that had happened in the United States since the end of the Second World War. Really, they had pretty much started in earnest in the 50s, and he said it's pretty much complete. And he talked about things like the destruction of our institutions, the family, the media, entertainment, and so forth. And that like the last thing to go basically is the law. Like when the law goes, like that's it. But as I look around at what's going on now and the creeping authoritarianism that, yes, government is imposing it, but people are begging for it. It's not just that they're coming in strong arming us like Tiananmen Square. You've got people, and it's a sizable percentage, like pretty much close to half the population is saying things like, regulate me harder, daddy.
Well, right. What's
they want this stuff.
Well, it's fear, right? And part of it is like, yes, they're begging for it because they've been sold fear. They've been sold fear. There's always a war on something, right? And I always like to say a war on rhymes with moron, right? So when they call something...
I like that. That's good.
Something like a war on
rhymes with moron.
Because they're selling you something, right?
That's true.
And so people are feared. They feel, oh, someone's gonna, for the children. Oh, we got to protect the children, right? Like, and yes, we do. But the fact is that, well, there've been a lot of authoritarian laws have been presented and pushed because it'll protect the kids. We got to protect against the terrorists. We got to protect against the communists. Got to protect against, there's always a threat, right? When people in government want more power and because they have the new way that they're going to make society better because everyone thinks they have the new utopian idea.
I was just thinking when you said, the children and protect the children. And then I think, okay, here I am. And there's, Moms for Liberty, Parents Defending Ed. And whatever we're saying, the children are in danger with whether it's comprehensive sex ed or medicalizing the gender ideology and pushing it on them and so forth. And I think, what's a little different now is that whoever's behind, the propaganda that pushes this movement on the side of the authoritarians, they have figured us out in one respect, us being parents or, people who are concerned about children, that we don't want to be helicopter parents. We are mostly liberal minded. We don't want to be seen as bigots or racists or non-inclusive or haters or anything. So it's like they're preying on our desire to be good and nice and kind and empathetic. And they'll come along and sell us things as being good for our children, or that the fear of our children not getting access to the thing we don't think is right, like they're going to kill themselves if you don't.
Well, yeah, that's
okay. So it's like you're afraid of that, but then they go, but they're going to commit suicide. So then you're going, well,
there's a bit of a word game going on here with a lot of the activism we see, and and a psychological game too, right? They do this with again, they do this with the gender ideology stuff. They say, well, if we don't give these kids everything they want, and we don't give them this and that and the other thing right away without any questions asked, then they'll commit suicide, right? And like I lost a number of friends in high school to suicide, so I don't take that particular threat very lightly.
Right, of course not.
But at the same time, going through those years, going through the growing up, from your, middle school years and your high school years and even a bit younger, they are confusing, and kids do feel depressed because they're going through all kinds of crazy hormones, a lot of them, right? Which can have lots of psychological effects on you. You're confused, you feel alienated, even if you're not, right? Even if every kid in your class feels alienated, right? Doesn't feel good. Like, what was the one, we were talking about movies earlier, the Christian Slater one, Pump Up the Volume, remember? And then even the popular girl hated her life and threw all her stuff in the microwave and turned it on and blew up her kitchen, right? Like, exactly. You don't know what's going on inside the head of the other kid sitting next to you in class, and you think, well, I hate my life and everything's horrible. Well, they may be thinking the same thing, but you in your mind. And we have this idea, because we don't live in anybody else's head. We don't get to see what their thoughts are. So it's very easy for us to fall into this trap of thinking, well, the grass is greener over there. They don't know what my problems are. And actually, they say this in training. I don't know. Well, sorry, I shouldn't say they say this in training as in the present tense. My training in this is going back a way. So I don't know what's current, but at least when I was trained briefly with regards to dealing with people who might be suicidal, is the first thing is to help them understand that they're not alone, that right. Lots of people feel this way, and that you're not crazy, there's nothing wrong with you, that people go through sometimes, and we'll help you through. But again, they've weaponized this. They've turned it into like a threat, so that parents are like, oh, well, I'm not an expert in psychology, and this person with a PhD is telling me that they need to transition my kid.
If parents were educated that the most important thing is to be there for your child is confused. Let your child know that it's normal to be confused. Let your child know that you're there for them through the confusion, and they will come out of this on the other side, that tomorrow's another day, that, they just have to get through today. Like all these things that, kids have a really hard time having a perspective in time and space. Mm-hmm. Like the moment right now is the most important thing in the world. They don't even really remember much about yesterday unless it was bad. And they don't have a picture of the future. I don't know how you were when you were a kid, but because of the threat of the nuclear annihilation, because of not really having a really solid family foundation to have as a role model, like I want that when I grow up, right? It's like any kind of role modeling I had was from television. We were sort of like a TV generation. So I'd be like, I like a little of this and a little of that, but I know that's not real. So I don't know. Is that realistic? So
Thank God we had good TV though.
well, that's true. But I just didn't, it was very murky. Okay. Well, what was murky for us, I have a feeling, is completely blank for them. They've been told the world's coming to an end in 12 years because of climate change. They've been told that the country is just terribly white supremacist. I really think we had a better handle, on the plus side, I think we had a better handle of the past being not as good as the present, whether it was in terms of racism, whether it was in terms of how gay people were treated, whether it's, I remember homophobia when it was real. When it was every day kind of a deal, I remember. And now they talk about homophobia and I'm like, what? And I shouldn't say that because I know people still go through it, but you know what I mean?
But I have a theory. Here's my theory on that. So a lot of this social theory that's going around that the kids, millennials essentially and younger, are being sort of indoctrinated with, I think are coming from academics who were born in the 1950s. They're like we talked about, being on the bookends of the Gen X generation. These are people on the younger bookend of the boom generation. Mm-hmm. The Robin DiAngelos and the Kimberly Crenshaws, both I think born in the 1950s, and they were busy getting their PhDs in the 1980s, and working on their postdocs in the 1990s, and they missed the huge cultural changes that happened when our generation was coming of age, because there was a huge pivot in the 1990s. The crime rate peaked in 1991, right?
Yeah, it was bad, and
then it started to fall, and it's continued to fall until, well, obviously some protesting and COVID and all kinds of other stuff in the last few years have made a mess of that. But it was pretty much even with economic ups and downs, the crime rate kept falling. And now there's lots of theories on why that was. But there was also huge cultural shifts. Like you said, you remember homophobia when it was real, right? When
I mean, I hope that doesn't come off like I'm saying it's not real, but you know what I mean? When it was like a daily.
No, it was ubiquitous.
Thing.
It was
everywhere.
And there was all of a sudden a major shift. And I would say it was a huge shift in the 1990s that it was no longer okay to be mean to the gays. It was no longer okay to make racist jokes. At least not like maliciously, right? Like people still did, but there was a tongue in cheek. There was like a camaraderie about it. And there was a shift though, or to be openly racist. Like probably you remember it more than I would, but I still remember it when people, in the 80s, there were still people who were open racism. I mean, there was also lots of gang wars in the 80s too. There was all kinds of stuff going on. And white supremacists, like real white supremacists.
Yeah, I remember them marching down the street in Skokie, that big trial in the Supreme Court, the whole thing. Yeah.
The neo-Nazis, KKK, all that's real white supremacy. There's this kind of BS version of it that they talk about now that I think comes from a lot of a race activist rhetoric where they just say all of society was built for this group and everything is white supremacy. And I think that's watering down the term, and it's dangerous because these days it's a fringe ideology, but they're still around.
And Buffalo.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
I mean, you have people on the internet and they see stuff, and
but when you call everything what you're doing is you're almost giving cover to those actual extremists, right?
Yep.
And I think that's very foolish and dangerous to do that. But anyway, there was this shift, and I think what happened was for us, right? Like we went through it. It was our coming of age years as a generation, and then 9/11 happened. Everything went crazy for a few years, and then these academics started publishing, and they were publishing their theories, their social theories, and their activist ideologies. Excuse me, and they were publishing based on information and research and readings they'd done from prior to the 1990s, from the 80s, 70s, 60s, and back.
Right.
And then they taught the next generation, millennials, who were college kids by that point, this is the way the world is, right? Meanwhile, there's this we're us sitting in the middle going, wait a second, that's no, like we rejected that already. What are you doing? And I don't think that the young boomers, this older academic generation, was even really aware. Kind of like I talked to
they've been locked in academia for 20 years.
Well,
I don't think they were aware.
No, well, it's kind of like if you're either an academic with your head locked in the library, or you're too busy raising your kids. Like I joked with my parents about this one time, and I mentioned some song that was really popular in 1980. And they were like, I have no idea what was going on in 1980. I was like, oh, right, you were busy with small children at the time, right? And same thing, friends of mine who have young kids right now, they have no idea what's going on in the world, at least for those first number of years, same thing. So they had their heads down, buried in the sand, working on their ideas, their theories about the world, right? And they missed huge cultural shifts, which were to the better. And now what they're doing, and they're teaching a version of the world that isn't real. And this is where it gets, well, yes, but these things still exist, but they aren't the norm anymore. These millennials now, and now Gen Z kids, are being raised to believe that white supremacy is everywhere, that everybody's a racist, that all this stuff. And you just, and those of us who went through that cultural shift, look at it and we think, this is crazy talk. This is insane. This is not real. This is yes, there are still pockets of racism. There's still places where people carry backward beliefs. There's still a generation that's still alive today that grew up in a world where it was okay to hate on the gays and to be racist, and they're retiring and expiring, and it's, some of them are, it's sad to see them go, but at the same time, that culture is, they still exist, but their culture is no longer
It's not. That culture is not dominant.
No.
And I feel like if there's one thing that we and our parent, like not our parents so much, but we and millennial parents even have done and are doing a pretty good job of, and it could very well be because we didn't have a lot of parental supervision from the generation that was still racist and homophobic.
Yeah.
So we had, the plus side of being raised by the neighborhood or raised by, like kind of like coming up with entertainment. Look, we're watching MTV, we're watching Soul Train, we're watching, I remember watching like that world really did open us up to the idea that we're all the same inside, that we could enjoy entertainment. I really credit with helping us go through that change much more than politics, much more than any policy that came into being or anything they taught us in school, because they didn't. I remember this, and something I'm telling people now about like curriculum. They're talking about, we're going to teach them this and teach them that. I'm like, guys, just leave the kids alone. First of all, you've got the least homophobic generation in human history, the least racist generation in human history, just organically, just because their parents, we grew up in a time period where it's like all our heroes were like as diverse as they possibly could be, from entertainment, sports, you name it, whatever it was. We didn't, you'd see race, but we didn't see race like maybe our parents or grandparents did. And so if you just
we celebrated difference and treated people like we treated people like everybody was a human being, and that was the new message for our generation.
Yeah, the new message was kind of like we have more in common than we are different.
Yep.
I think that certainly I grew up 100% believing in the melting pot. There was absolutely nothing in my upbringing that taught me any different than that. And so imagine my shock and surprise when I have children and they're starting, I had to put them in public school, and suddenly it's like, now America's a very racist place and this is happening. And I'm like, I'm sorry, do you live in a different country than I do? Like, where are you? What in the world are you talking about?
Well, this is part of indoctrination.
I just feel so bizarre because we didn't feel like that.
Well,
we didn't grow up like that.
If you're told, if you're told, here, put on these blue tinted glasses, and everything you see through those blue tinted glasses will look blue, will have a blue tint. That's right. True. So what's being done to the kids today by these educators, by these activists? Now they're activist academics, right? And to me, I think activism should never be. If you're an academic or a journalist or working in the law, especially, the activism and bias should be something you avoid as much as possible.
In the school, for sure.
Sure. But their activist view, right? They're projecting this view of the world that predates 1989, right? It's, and I say 1989 because that's isn't that I think it's the same year for Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality, but
yes, also, it is.
Peggy McIntosh's knapsack of,
I think it was privilege. 87, but it doesn't matter. It's same thing.
These ideas, right? They came up with these in the 1980s, which means they're based on a world that existed before that, right? So all of the world that existed up to that point was what inspired them to come up with these ideas for looking at the world. Right. But then they're applying those things to a completely different world. Right. Exactly. And that's the problem. So what they're doing is they're actually rekindling racism, reinstalling people. They're encouraging people to view each other through a racial lens or through a gender ideology and all these other things, and to make it about those things, to make personality about those things, rather than seeing everybody as individuals, which is what we finally got, right? Like,
exactly.
Our parents' generations, they were still, we're Methodists and they're Baptists and they're Catholics, right? They were still, those were their identity groups, and
we didn't have that.
And well, those people down the road, they're Italians, and we don't, and well, they're Irish, right? So they had their identity politics, right? And then we were like, hey, we're all individuals for like what, 10, 15 years. Finally, we achieved this culture of individuality, and then people from the past started teaching the millennial generation identity politics again. So we've gone back into this world where everybody's at each other's throats, everybody's arguing, everybody's bickering, and people aren't realizing that they're all individual human beings first and foremost. And that to me is really sad.
It's so sad. It's like, I feel like we finally had this great gift to give to our kids. I mean, I remember even thinking that. I remember when I had my first daughter thinking, I'm really glad that I'm going to be able to bring up my children in a world where everybody just gets to be. Like I really felt like, because I remember being a kid, and I even remember personally experiencing some anti-Semitism directed at me. And I knew that there's always latent racism. There's always latent homophobia. I knew these things were going to always be. There always are, because the bad ideas.
A few people here and there, and bad ideas take.
Well,
and it takes time for old generations to die out, right?
And even when they do, it's what is the mainstream, right? Yeah. So like what I felt like was the mainstream idea was we're all essentially, Americans. And then it lasted this tiny, like it was like 5 minutes. I literally had this kid. She's 2 years old. We moved to North Carolina. And right away, I'm starting to see the political correctness stuff. Political correctness. Like really, this is when Bill Maher had his first show, Politically Correct. Yeah. And I suddenly was like, wait a minute. I just got excited about the fact that it was okay to, Richard Pryor would go on stage and talk about white people and black people, and he did all these things, and we would all laugh. Like, he made fun of white people, he made fun of black, and same with George Carlin and all this kind of stuff. And I felt like, okay, we have finally arrived at a place where our biggest problems are political, and not cultural. And then it didn't last. I wish I could figure out. You made the point of like 89, 90, they published, they did these things, but that's still up in academia.
Well, here's the thing.
What do you think happened?
When in the 1990s, in the early 1990s, when I was an undergraduate, or very early 90s, I remember there were all these new programs popping up on campuses, and they were all like ended in the word studies, and they were like, I think it was women's studies, and then that became eventually became gender studies later. But there was also like cultural studies and post-colonial studies and all these. And eventually, I think they got they said we're gonna look at these previously marginalized or unexamined areas of study and bring new light to them. And I remember thinking at the time, that's great. That sounds really interesting. How fascinating! That would be awesome. And instead of actually doing the research, and not that they haven't done any research, but a lot of them dove headlong into theory, and I use the word theory, capital theory. Right. They dove into sort of critical theory, critical consciousness, the idea, and I don't mean critical thinking. Right. A lot of people make that mistake, and like I said earlier, there's this word, bait and switch with words that this sort of activist movement uses. So they call it critical theory or critical race theory or critical social justice, or all these different critical. And what that means is not critical thinking, but critique. And I mean, it's derived from philosophy. It comes down, and I don't want to get too into the details of it, but my other field of study was continental philosophy and phenomenology and postmodernism and all that. And I was so glad to be done. Back in the 90s, I was like, thank God I can put this away and never have to think of this crap again. But now I have to dredge it up because it's become this pop thing, this pop culture thing. Anyway, the theory, and it's what it is it's subjective. So don't believe in anything. Anything outside the mind can't be proven to exist. It's just like, well, how can you prove the thing that you're perceiving? What if your eyes are deceiving you? The only thing you can know is what is in your own head. Right. And it's all very convoluted. But the point being, it's subjective, it's theory, it's it's critique. So it becomes interpretive. Right. So we're going to interpret a TV show, a work of literature, a social situation, a political thing, an identity according to our own perspective. So it could be an autoethnographic perspective. Right. Like when I was a student, you weren't supposed to use the first person in your writing, right? It was verboten. It was considered unprofessional. Now they're like, everybody uses the first person. In fact, they now have something called an autoethnographic thesis where you can write about yourself. And it's like,
okay,
right? So
that's interesting.
The academic world, and so it started, right, with these academics
Right.
in the late 80s. It became popular. These became like new programs. And I don't know, I mean, I didn't attend every single university across North America and the world, but I would imagine if these were popping up on my campus, they were probably popping up in other campuses too. They were really popular at the time. And it's too bad that they didn't actually produce interesting illuminations of certain aspects of culture, because that would have been interesting. Instead, what they kind of became was activist programs. They became the activist indoctrination programs. And so they spent the next 30 years, and this, so 1990 to now is like 32 years. So they spent the next several decades developing their own theories, their own activist theories. And those kids that started in those programs in the 1990s and early 2000s went on to work in media, to become teachers, to become, right? And so now we're seeing that wave of people who are educated to be activists. And so they're not teachers, they're activist teachers. They're not journalists, they're activist journalists. I mean, even in the 1990s, at one point, I actually had I was an entertainment journalist briefly. I had, you know, a cultural column, and went to Lollapalooza and got backstage and interviewed a bunch of bands and did all that stuff, you know, as a young person. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll go into journalism. And even then I interviewed with a journalism program, a couple programs, one in particular. They asked me, said, what kind of journalist would you like to be? And I said, well, I don't know. I thought maybe, I mean, print is where it's at, but maybe television. And they were like, no, you don't understand the question. I said, what do you mean? They said, what kind of journalist do you want to be? I said,
what?
And I said, I don't.
Like, for real? They actually put it that way?
They were like, do you want to be a neo-Marxist, a conservative, a neoliberal? Like, you have to pick your politics, because that's what you're going to get hired on the basis of, right? And I was like, I thought the whole point was to present news reporting in as dispassionate and as non-biased a manner as possible. And they laughed and they said, no, that's nobody does that anymore. No, you're going to get hired to be the conservative or the Marxist or the neoliberal or whatever, and represent that viewpoint, which is why so much news reporting, even within an organization, can be so polarized, because the stories aren't being presented in as fair and balanced and objective. They don't believe in objectivity. Objectivity, I don't know if you've noticed this, but anytime someone says, well, be objective, they say, oh, that's impossible. Nobody's objective. Everybody's biased. And I feel like it's this weird intellectual temper tantrum they've had, where it's like, okay, yes, philosophically, and yes, it's true. Philosophically, you cannot be 100% purely objective. You cannot know 100% that something is a fact, because you're trapped in your own subjective viewpoint. Right? But it's like they said, well, if we can't 100% be 100% sure, then throw it all away. Forget it all. We're just going to be as subjective as possible and be as biased as possible and be activists all day long. And it's like, well, instead of saying, well, look, maybe we can't achieve 100% perfection of objectivity, but maybe that's like an unachievable ideal that we hold up in the distance and try our best to get as close to that as possible. Right? Like, so I take the view that your journalism, the quality of your journalism or your academic work, is directly proportional to your ability to be as objective as possible. That's my view. That is not currently the popular view in academia or media.
Yeah, I've noticed that.
So that's 30 years ago that they laughed me out of their office for, and they said, like, this is the new way, which explains so much of the polarization. So we've had 30 years of polarized media, and look where we are, right?
Exactly.
Where nobody trusts anybody, nobody trusts any media. Everybody's accusing everybody of spin, because everybody's engaging in spin, because they've all become activists. And professionalism is another dirty word. Being professional. Well, that's just white supremacist code or some nonsense like that now. Like,
so do you ever ask people like, so are you literally saying we should be unprofessional? Like, what's if being professional is white supremacist, then are we supposed to be like, what are we supposed to be?
I don't know where that one comes from. I think it may have something to do with hair. Frankly,
Hair.
Yeah, like I think back in the 80s or at some point, or maybe there was like some old people who owned a business somewhere complained that somebody had dreadlocks. Right. And they said that it's not professional and they wanted them to get a haircut and show up. You know, remember the old get a haircut and get a real job, right? Which is something everybody had to deal with back in the 80s.
Yeah.
Prior to the 1990s. It wasn't until really the last decade or so that you could have different colored hair.
That's true. Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, it wasn't racialized.
No.
I mean, I had to wear stockings to work. And I had to wear my hair certain ways. And I mean, not like a style per se, but it had to be, well groomed and combed. And, there's certain things like you couldn't just have like crazy
It couldn't
hair.
be a funny color, and it couldn't be in a style that wasn't, and that was for everybody, right?
Yeah.
That was across the board. Yep. But again, this is this idea that if you've been told that everything is racism or sexism, then you'll see everything as racism or sexism, right? I think it was actually the opening. Carrie Smith did an interview on Triggerpod, Trigonometry.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the opening, and I try to recommend people do this. Like, watch the whole thing if you have the time for it. It's a great interview. But the opening clip, it's like 9 seconds long. If you don't have time, watch, just find that, watch the first 9 seconds, and what she says about it's like putting on glasses and looking for the racism. And I think of that quite often because that's really what it is. You've got these glasses on and someone's mean to you. Well, it must be sexism or racism because that's how you're going to interpret everything, right? Exactly. So someone gave you a hard time about your hairstyle. Well, so that's white supremacy, right? Because you've been told the whole world is some kind of supremacist thing. It's like it's exhausting to think that people go through every day walking around the world interacting with each other, with people, believing that they're oppressed or that someone's their oppressor and that there's power dynamics going on, when the fact is most people, especially pretty much over 18, nobody has any power over anyone. Like, I get this all the time on Twitter. I get this like white male people post my own photo at me and say poster boy for white supremacy. I'm like, get lost.
You're like, I don't have that power, but thanks.
Yeah, and like misogyny and patriarchy and all this nonsense. And I'm like,
blah blah blah.
Most of my life, including the jobs I had in high school, right? Like working at Pizza Hut, putting the pepperonis on the pizza and dishes, and I did dish pit. I did all these crappy jobs, and then working in the entertainment industry, survival jobs that I had. I worked at a furniture store for years. Did the bartending and waiting tables and all that stuff. Almost all of my bosses, managers, and employers, and the gatekeepers for my career have been women.
Yeah.
Right. So, and I'm like, so when I hear this like male dominated, blah, blah, blah. Right. So I'm like, yeah, sorry. I don't know. Maybe there was a difference between early Gen X and younger Gen X, but at least my experience coming of age in the 1990s and beyond is that most of my career, almost all of my jobs have always been with women in positions of power. So the idea in a social situation or in a business situation or a professional situation that I have power, no, sorry.
I know, right?
But it's this labeling.
And the thing is, like I said, I look back at when we were kids, and I know there's like a distance between us as far as like almost a decade, but it's still we're Gen X is like, I think I've read it. We're the smallest generation, and in both in terms of length of time and even how many people are in it. Yeah. But I think the uniformity of our experience culturally sets us apart, or I shouldn't say sets us apart, makes us more like the prior generations, even though we had some cutting edge stuff that happened, like the end of overt racism and homophobia. Like, we did have the identity thing coming in because of the latchkey kid thing. But the generations that have come after us, I think there's more difference, I think, between someone born in like 2000 than in someone born in 2010. There's that's you wouldn't think there would be, but there, when I meet these people, and or even in my own children, 2003 and then 2008, and I'm like, they're already have a different perspective because my eldest remembers certain things that my youngest is like completely oblivious to. And what they've gotten better at lately, I think, is memory holing things. So with all of the information coming at us, they've been able to better memory hole the past, not just the distant past, but the recent past. So where if something happened when we were kids, even the prior year or 2 years before or 3 years before or whatever, we like Challenger explosion. Let's just take that as an example. Yeah. Okay. It wasn't over and done with 6 weeks later. You know what I mean? It's like, or even
the turnover, the cultural turnover of information is so fast now. It's so
fast. So like we had a longer period of time to cope with things, understand things, kind of think about them, talk about them, figure it out. I feel like there's a rush to make sense of the nonsensical, the random, the chaotic, the scary, while at the same time we have more ability to have it shoved in our face 24/7. It's like, and of course, if it leads, it leads.
What's that Bo Burnham song? And Welcome to the Internet, a little bit of everything all the time. Isn't that?
Yeah, I've heard that, and I just feel like it's got to be. So I feel like one of the things that we in our generation don't necessarily understand about this one is what that feels like. I find myself looking at these kids and all I can do is feel like horrified. Like I remember how awkward it was to be, a preteen and a teenager. I remember all of the things coming at us and all that. And I think, okay, take the 11 to 16-year-old me and stick me today with boom, 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 and TikTok and Tumblr and this and that and the other.
Well, it's information.
I don't know. I've made it out alive, to be honest. I don't know.
I think one thing we had that maybe isn't really being, I don't know, maybe it is. I don't know. Maybe they know it instinctively. It's hard to tell. Is that we knew that there were a lot of fads, right? And we would often write things off as fads. And I think that's what's happening now with a lot of what's going on with TikTok. I mean, it was first it was Facebook, then everybody's grandma was on Facebook, so nobody was on Facebook anymore. And then it was Twitter, and then it was Snapchat, and then now it's TikTok, and Vine was before there was TikTok. There was Vine. Let's not forget that Vines,
right?
Back in our day, we called these things fads, right? There were fads. They were the latest thing, the latest craze, and they came and went. So it's not that different. Although it is faster, and like you said, the memory hole things so quickly, as if like, and it feels like, oh well, that happened 2 weeks ago, but it feels like it was 10 years ago.
Exactly.
There's actually an interesting book by an author, and I found it randomly in, I want to say, I think it was it 8th or 9th grade. I found this randomly in the school library, and it's a book called Future Shock by Alvin Toffler, and
I've heard of that book.
And he talks about how like everything's getting faster and fast. Cultural changes are happening faster and faster. And eventually cultural change will be happening so fast that we'll just become completely disoriented from everything. And there'll be no continuity. And I feel like that's possibly one of the issues that we're facing right now, is that there's so many cultural niches, and that there's so much sort of siloing of information, right? Politically, like, well, we're Republicans, so we only watch Fox News and read Breitbart, and well, we're this, and we only watch CNBC, and then they have completely different versions of reality. Or I'm part of the the LGBT community, therefore I only I'm interested in these things, and the people who live like that, who live differently, who are moose hunters in Alaska. Not that they couldn't have LGBTQ moose hunters in Alaska, but just people have become. I think there's this fragmentation, And one thing that we had that they don't have right now is, I think, cultural hubs. And this is a sort of a weird, like people make fun of it, but some of us complain. They're like, well, when MTV stopped playing music videos,
Right.
and they switched to reality TV, which, by the way, most of it is fake.
We know that. Yeah.
A lot of
At
people
least
don't know that.
I know. Can you believe not knowing that? I can't
Well,
imagine
if
not
you were
knowing
a
that.
kid, if you're a kid growing up watching MTV reality TV shows, and nobody's
true.
telling you it's fake, right? You'll just think it's real.
True. Good point.
So anyway, there's this fragmentation, and we had at least we had these cultural hubs where everybody would be like aware of the new thing was going on, and our activists back in the 90s were musicians, right? They were, and eventually they got annoying. Like everybody complains about Bono, remember? Like,
yes,
right. Well, but when he first started being an activist, it wasn't that bad. It was only when he like just kept pushing it and pushing it and pushing. And I think maybe that's why the corporations said, look, we're shutting down MTV. We're going to put this reality crap on there and it'll shut the musicians up. Right. I don't know.
Right.
Maybe that's conspiracy theory, but like,
or maybe they just, I really wish I did understand why suddenly we started like wanting to watch other people live their lives. But it certainly took off. Whoever invented it understood that.
There were a couple of writers there were some strikes, some writers and actors strikes in the early 2000s, late.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember being offered jobs in Los Angeles to be a writer on a reality TV show, to be a writer on an unscripted show, right? So I would have to sign an NDA and never admit to being a writer on an unscripted show.
Right. A writer.
Right.
On an
and so you see,
show.
You see the credits, and they said like 16 producers and no writers. Right. Because at the time, I was a non-union. I wasn't in the Writers Guild, and I was a young writer, and they were like, oh, you should come work. We like your writing. You should come work. And so like you're coming up with scenarios, you're coming up with dramatic moments, and half the people on a lot of these shows, at least back then, a lot of them were just out of work actors dropping out of SAG and AFTRA. So they could, because their managers were like, you need to, at the time they thought, well, if you could at least get exposure, right? Maybe that'll help launch your acting career, right? And didn't work for most. Now I think now they're telling them they got to go become YouTube influencers to start their acting careers or some crap. But, or maybe it's TikTok now. I don't know. Anyway, but like it's so fake. And it's it's contrived, but I think a lot of those shows sprung up because they were cheap to produce. They satisfied our nosy, gossipy, tabloid reading aspect of the crappy part of our human nature is to be nosy and gossipy about other people. And so it appeals to everybody. So I remember one of the first big show was Big Brother, right? Like that was one of the first big shows. Yes. Yep. So it keys into this idea, our weird little nosy envy, the parts of our human nature that we really shouldn't be very proud of. Remember before reality TV came out, and tabloid was a dirty word.
That's
right.
True.
Right. Yeah. Now nobody mentioned tabloid. People are kind of, I'd say millennials. I don't know. Like I don't.
No, that's a really good observation. Like as you mention it, I think when I was growing up, there were certain things that were that were still taboo that I really wish had stayed taboo. One of them was, talking about other people, like publicly talking about or gossiping about other people's private lives. Mm-hmm. That's not to say that people didn't do it. It was just one of those things that you knew you weren't supposed to be doing. You did it behind closed doors. You did it very privately. And it would have been considered the most shameful thing in the world if it were found out that you were doing it. It's definitely not something you would have relished in. Like gossip it would be.
Gossip was a bad thing. Gossip was.
Yeah, it was
now everybody just post it to their social media.
Yeah, it was seen as, it's absolutely amazing. It was seen as being this unseemly thing that you would gossip. It was something that middle school girls did. And, you know, even in entertainment, I think they did a good job of capturing the dark side of it. We had movies that showed even way before Mean Girls, okay? You had the Heathers and you had
Hmm.
movies like that where they depicted the popular girls who did a lot of gossip and who were mean and were pick people apart for their appearance and wanted to cancel someone out of the social circle, like we're going to make it so no one wants to date you and all that. We all knew they were the bad people. Like
Yeah.
that was like they're the bad guys. And what always cracked me up is how nobody ever, even the people who were those people, never identified with those people. It always cracked me up. As like, aren't
Yeah.
they terrible? I'm like, you are those people. So,
Well,
and
but
then of course
now,
those people grew up and became the PTA moms. And so,
well, and now they've weaponized it, and if you are a gossip about other people's business, and you're gonna get them outed for doing some bad thing or some embarrassing thing or something that should make them a social pariah. Well, that now you're enacting social justice. You're a social justice warrior, right?
exactly. Now,
So
yeah, now
you're the good
it's
guy.
exactly the people who gossip more effectively or
Yeah.
who get the narrative out there first, even if it's a total lie,
Yeah.
they can win the day. And it seems like somewhere between 1990 and 2000, let's say 10, the truth died. It just died. And it was, I think it was kind of a life support starting in the 2000s, but it really, and honestly, I give Bill Clinton a lot of credit for making truth optional. But I mean, I know that there are other people who disagree with me, but the guy flagrantly lied and was like, but we like him because he's Bill Clinton, and I'm like, I'm sorry, he's the president of the United States. And he did something really egregious. And we know that he lied. He perjured himself. He did, and y'all
Yeah.
are just like, whatever.
Well, part of that was, I think, was it who was it Gingrich?
Yeah, Gingrich was in the Contract with
No,
America and with
no, but wasn't
with Clinton.
he was in the middle of, he was the one impeaching Clinton, wasn't he?
Well,
Over the lie. I think I saw something about and then
he
meanwhile
worked with Clinton on the welfare reform and stuff, but I don't know. I don't remember about the
I
impeachment.
think he was directly involved in that. And someone made the comment. They said, yeah, the whole time he was making a big stink about Bill Clinton lying about his affair, Gingrich was having an affair himself, right? And so,
Right.
like, you're like, everybody's a hypocrite, right? So
Yeah, we and there were a couple of really prominent clergy members who were outed as having what was that guy, Jimmy Swaggart? Remember that? And he was caught in a hotel room. And then there was the guy with Tammy Faye, the Bakers, and they're swindling and all that. It's almost like everybody's dirty laundry. I really don't remember growing up in the 80s. I don't remember dirty laundry being everyday fare. Like you said, tabloid was a dirty word. If you went into the grocery store and they had like the Star and the News of the World
and that,
Inquirer, that was like.
And then there was the one with Bat Boy. Remember Bat Boy? Yeah.
Right. But that was like trashy stuff. Yeah. Like nobody legit read that.
Well, so tabloids were trash. They were like of the news. There was the news journalism, and then there was tabloids, right? And then social media came along, and everyone had their own tabloid. Everyone had their own Facebook page. Everyone had their own website, and everybody could spread gossip and say whatever they wanted. So then the news journalists, and then some real actual scoops started happening. Real scoops started happening in the online world, and of course the tabloid people who would play it a little fast and loose with their ethics were able to get stuff out faster than the news journalists. So then news journalists, like actual news organizations, were competing, trying to get their stories out first, because it was who could get the story out first. Right. And so then they weren't checking their facts as carefully. So the quality of journalism just dropped and dropped and dropped and dropped because it had to come out right away. Or, hey, what's the old line? A lie has traveled all the way around the world before the truth has even got its shoes on.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's so true.
And that's it, right? So I don't know if so much the truth died, but so much as nobody had time for it because everything had to be this, right? So quick. But also there's this subjectivist theory, which goes back to what I talked about in academia and in journalism, is that, well, we don't believe in objectivity. We don't believe in truth. What do you mean by truth? Your truth or my truth, right? And
oh my God. Yeah, I know. And then they're doing it today. My truth, your truth.
My truth. right? Well, so then everybody's basically their opinions are valid. Well, what are we even talking about anymore? So
Right.
not only is so again, what this has done is it breaks down our when the focus has been shifted away from, well, what are the facts, what's the data, right? Like can we gather some societal information and do some wide studies on what's going on now, right? Why is so much of this the studies with like these and you excuse me, see like a lot of meta analyses, I see a lot of these be coming out, and they're studies, and you look at the dates on them, and they're pulling on previous studies that are actually pulling on previous studies, and you kind of like, okay, a lot of this information is now decades old, but then it's been published in 2022 as though it's a recent thing, and it's a meta-analysis of the last. And I'm like, yeah, well, that's great, because I don't think a study of people and their relationships in their early 20s from in 2022, if you're claiming this is the culture, should be pulling data from the 1970s and 80s. Right. Because it's very culturally very different generations.
Exactly.
And so
and they do it though. And they're doing it even with the social emotional learning stuff. They're pulling data from 2011. And I'm like, I'm sorry, you can't, it's a different world already.
So fast.
Things are changing so fast. And what the things they're doing are also relatively extreme. I shouldn't say relatively extreme. That sounds weird, but they're compared to, for example, when I started in public school in 4th grade, and then I left public school after 9th grade, there was zero change. I mean, I can confidently say that there was zero change between how they taught the subjects and what they were doing in school from the time I entered 4th grade until I left 9th grade, in terms of like how the teachers taught. We sat in rows at desks. The teacher was at the front of the room. Yeah. You had textbooks. There wasn't a period of time where suddenly it was like, and now we're not using books anymore. I mean, but what I've seen in the last 10 years in schooling, and even in higher education, is monumental change. Somebody could have entered kindergarten, and then by the time they leave in high school, it's like a completely different institution. Yeah. And they're doing it all the time. It's not like, well, I just happened to have caught them in the middle of big change. The difference between last year and this year, the year before and the year before that, huge differences. And these kids, they're not just adapting to being in a new grade. They're not just adapting to being a new age. They're not just adapting to everything going on in their lives. They will come back to school in the fall, leaving COVID out of it. They come back to school in the fall, and it's like, what is school now? Because they keep changing it.
This is not, again, we talked about things happening bottom up or organically versus sort of things that are contrived. And part of this is that in the education sector, there's so much activism now among teachers and people who plan curriculum and education boards and, at multiple levels of government. Sure. And so these changes are these fundamental shifts. A lot of it is that they're ideological. They're based on ideas about what they think needs to be taught, needs to be the focus. And you see people complaining about it. There's a lot going on right now. I mean, hard not to notice.
Yeah, I'm one of those people complaining.
Yeah, and like parents are saying, hey, wait a second. I think we touched on this briefly yesterday when we were talking about how, I think that there have been two silver linings. I mean, I know a lot of people on the sort of the Democrats, the Democratic to the end of the left, the more liberal side, and over to the progressives and socialists. Everybody on that side of lost their minds when Donald Trump got elected. And I said, like, I was not a fan of him. I don't have a whole lot of good things to say about him. And that's fine. But there's a silver lining here, is that when he got elected, a lot of the people pushing a lot of this ideology kind of lost their minds, and they kind of tipped their cards and became almost forceful about their ideological ideas. And like he became this boogeyman for them, and they just went crazy. And then I think the second cloud with a silver lining is this COVID situation for the last 2 years, because parents were able, with Zoom class, parents were finally able to hear what the teachers were teaching to their kids. And they're like,
Yep.
wait a second. There's some of this stuff that they're downloading into my kid's brain. It is very political,
Yep.
and very
Yep.
questionable. A lot of it, at the very least, contentious,
Mm.
and worthy of discussion and debate before they make it official policy, and almost to the detriment of learning math and
Yeah.
history and geography and science, like
Well,
learning actual,
definitely. Yeah.
right? Because they're spending all this time on ideology, and the kids aren't learning their actual school subjects.
They're spending a lot of time in emotions too. And
Yeah.
one thing that I'm also thinking back, to when we were kids, and tell me if it was different for you, but I don't remember any of my teachers asking me how I was feeling. Like, like inside of myself, or like what if I was having trouble at home, or if like my got along with my parents, whatever.
That would be
And I'll be
creepy.
honest with you, I'm so glad they didn't, because
That would have been creepy. That would have been really
it would have been
creepy.
so creepy. I
Very
would not have
nosy.
liked it.
Yeah.
And when I hear adults today who are, again, they're our vintage. Okay. So there were, some of them in their 20s, right? But the ones who are directing all of this, saying it's necessary, proclaiming that it's, we're bad, oppressive people if we don't allow it. They grew up in the same world we grew up in. And I'm like, hey, did you forget?
Maybe they felt neglected by their parents, so now they're overcompensating by being too nosy, too pushy. Yeah.
I feel like they're projecting all kinds of stuff onto these kids, like what they would have wanted, or maybe they're jealous of today's kid. I can't figure it out.
I think maybe it is maybe some of them felt left out and felt maybe they needed more attention when they were younger and they didn't get the attention they wanted. So now they're going to make sure that every kid gets constant, total attention, and to the point of obnoxious behavior by the adults. I mean, there's this whole thing about like knowing your teacher's personal life. I think I've seen people complaining about that, and I'm like, when we went through school, we didn't like. I knew there were two teachers at different high schools who had the same last name, and eventually we figured out that they were married, right? And that's about as much as we knew about the teachers, right? And like
exactly,
and that's it, right? Nowadays they got these teachers telling their students about their personal lives and their sexual orientations and all that stuff, and it's like, okay, like they're great, they're third graders, like shut up. Do your job. Teach them math. Don't be talking about whatever you do on your private time with the 8-year-olds. It's inappropriate.
Well, okay, so I mean, just a couple more questions I want to ask before we wrap up. But
sure.
When you were growing up, and if it's too personal, you don't have to answer, but like a lot of us in our generation didn't have awesome relationships with our parents. I mean, it doesn't mean they were awful. Maybe they were, they were fine or they were okay, but it wasn't like, we didn't necessarily have the close knit father knows best kind of families. Most people growing up in our generation. So, but I still feel like I didn't have the expectation necessarily that I was supposed to, meaning, even though I could look around and see that other kids had more close-knit families or that they didn't have divorced parents, something about my expectations was like that, life isn't supposed to be a bowl of cherries. Like I just had a general, whether it was my family life or, how much stuff I had, whether it was material things. And I mean, granted, I had a pretty nice life. I didn't want for a lot of necessities, but at the same time, there was always somebody who had more, and there was always somebody prettier, and there was always somebody smarter. And there was, I was picked on, I was bullied, but I didn't feel like this made me special, or this made that I somehow instinctively knew that I wasn't alone about like that, even you could feel alone in the moment, but it was like, yeah, other people get bullied. I feel like today there is this the only emphasis on the individual is on making sure each individual knows how uniquely victimized they are.
Well, yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I thought you were going to say how unique they are. And then when you added the second part, uniquely victimized they are. And that's probably the big problem right now, is that everybody's being taught that they're all victims, and everybody's in this competition to be a victim because being a victim makes you safe, right? If you're a victim, then you get safety, you get resources, you get someone to hold your hand, you get sympathy, you get excused when you behave badly. Oh, well, you know, they're just a victim. They've been hurt in other ways, so of course we're gonna treat them with kid gloves because, you know, they're hurt, you know, and they're just lashing out because of the hurt that they've experienced, right?
That was like the last thing I wanted to be perceived as.
Well, that the problem is, like, when you teach kids, tell them, well, you're privileged in this way and you're this and that, and you blame them for that, this, that, and the other thing because of their identity groups, right? Not because of who they are, not because of anything they ever did. A lot of them are going to jump on to, well, can I be a different identity? And one that's not.
Seems like an easy way out, doesn't it?
Right?
So in a way.
So instead of the young millennials who would just, you know, the cutters, remember them? Who would just sit there and be angry about how much, like, our generation, like, our slogans were like, life sucks, wear a helmet, right? Like just like
reality bites.
Yeah.
Sucks, wear a helmet.
Sucks. Right. We all knew it, right? And we all said it to each other. Yeah. Well, life sucks. What can you do about it?
We complained plenty. We definitely did. Looking back at some of the movies, definitely complained.
But we had gallows solidarity. We were like, yeah, it sucks. Being young, growing up, it sucks. Like, you know, yeah, my town is basically the town from Footloose, right? It's no fun. There's nothing to do. You're not allowed to dance, you know. They're banned skateboarding. They hate everybody. All the fogies hate everybody young. And, you know, so at least we had that. Whereas now some kids are told, well, you're born a victim. Other kids are told you're born an oppressor, right? It undermines all of their senses of self, because they're applying these labels to them, not based on who they are. They don't even know who they are yet, but they're being told you're this, you're that, and you're all these other things. And you should have feelings about those things. And then, but if you hurt, if you're harmed, if you're a victim, we have so much resources for you, right? We have gobs and gobs and gobs of sympathy and someone to hold your hand and pat you in the head and make you feel real good. Oh,
and here's some pills.
Let me have that. Let me have all these resources to help me out because I'm a victim. Yeah. So, of course, they're basically incentivizing victimhood now. And it sucks because there are kids out there who are having problems, who have real issues, and those resources should be going to them.
Right.
But when they've put these colored glasses, these tinted kaleidoscope glasses, forget tinted, kaleidoscope, like onto every kid, with this sort of identity politics, and this sort of intersectional victimhood, right? That, well, there are all your different layers of victimhood, and here are all your different layers of oppression, and these people are oppressing you this way, and that person is microaggressing you, and they're just looking for it everywhere.
Right.
Like I said, watch the first 9 seconds of Carrie's thing, and of course, finish watching this one first. But no, I mean, what's the expression? When all you have is a hammer, everything's like a nail.
Exactly.
Right? So,
but I feel like they are running around trying to sell solutions. So they're like making their solutions in search of problems. And every time they say, well, you know, the children have to do this and they have to find themselves on these. And I always want to say, why? Why do they have to? How does this benefit them? Well, then they'll be critically conscious when then they can fix it. And I'm like, they're children. Nobody came to me when I was 11 and said, fix the world. Be an activist to fix the world. And if they had, I'm just really glad they didn't, because that was not a thing I wanted to take on.
We learned to compost. That was what we learned. That was our activism they taught us.
Yeah.
A few years later.
Mine was just turn off the lights and like don't let the water run while you brush your teeth. That was and recycling became a new thing. So that was important. But there was, you know, we were still putting baby oil on our bodies and lying out in the sun and
to get the better tan with the tin foil.
Sit with the tin foil. So
like
things
George
were
Hamilton. Yeah.
Things were, oh my God, things were so different. But all right, let me ask you last question. Being that you're a writer, you like historical fiction, and also you're in the film business. Okay.
Yeah.
If if a kid today, let's say a 13, 14-year-old said, all right, I really want to better understand you Gen Xers. Because you keep saying that like your life was so different and America was so different when you're, well, I don't get it. What do you mean it was so different? Can you pick like, I don't know, a couple movies or a book or something? Like, what would you say? You know what? Go consume this popular culture and you'll probably get a better sense of what we're about. What would you pick?
Oh God, these are the worst questions for me because I always blank. I always blank on like in my head. There's like all these movies flying.
You can
past
rapid
me.
fire them. I don't care. But like,
No, they're going so fast that I can't pick them out of the. It's like the airport, the little in the old clickers that used to.
It goes tick, 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 tick,
yes, and
yeah.
I'm like, what movies to understand? Like, I would say comedies, like when people were, because our Gen X is known. We're known for
Think of a Police Academy.
Well, Police Academy, but I was also going to say, what was that movie? Like, I just rewatched Gonna Get You, Sucker. I'm Gonna Get You, Sucker.
Oh, yeah, that's a great one.
The other night. That's a fantastic one. And in fact, like, and it speaks to a lot of stuff today because, like, remember there's that, he goes to see they're not the Black Panthers, but the spoof of, right? And like the guy comes out,
exactly.
And
the fake Panthers.
Then his little kids come out and they're these little blonde hair bloke, and they're like talking about history of Abraham Lincoln, and they're like, once upon a time there was a piece of poor white trash, maybe, you know, and like and like people laughed, right? People could still laugh at this stuff, and they were making some social commentary, but they were also poking fun at some social commentary, right? And so there was still a sense of humor. Yeah, political correctness existed in the 1990s, and it's kind of gone out of hand. It's become everybody's afraid of everything now, and afraid of saying the wrong thing and making a mistake and having your career canceled and you'll never work in this town again. Blah blah blah. Right.
Right.
But no, and like, remember that movie? Was it White Chicks? Remember
that was pretty funny too.
Like, that was funny. So there was humor.
Even in Living Color on TV.
Oh, those
the Wayans brothers.
Well, the Wayans brothers. And wasn't like Jim Carrey one of their regulars?
Yeah, he was one of the people. Mm-hmm.
And Jennifer Lopez, wasn't she one of the dancers on that? Was she a fly girl?
I think she might have been.
So like there was so much cultural intermixing and mingling, and everybody was sharing culture and riffing off each other and creating new things and remixes from each other. So this whole like weird racial divide that's going on right now, and not just racial divide, but like gender divide and sexuality divide, and everybody breaking off into their own little camps. That's like almost the antithesis. In fact, to me, that's not culture. Like, they're like, no, this is our culture and it will become sacred. And I'm like, well, then it's dead. Because if it's not alive and it's not growing and evolving, then it's history, right? And history's great and interesting, but it's dead. It's, once you set it in stone, call it a tombstone, because that's what it is. So every culture that exists today is a combination of many cultures that came before it over thousands of years, right? Like, it's always evolving, it's always changing, and we're always learning from. I mean, people talk about music, right? Well, where does rock music come from? And some people say, well, it comes from the blues, and say, well, the blues, where does it come from? Multiple influences, right? Because there's old folk music from Europe. There's sea shanties, and everybody's trying to claim it as their own. The reality is, most of the culture we have today is same thing with recipes, right? Like, oh, well, we can't cultural appropriate the tomato because, oops, the Italians, most of Italian cuisine, like, I mean, the tomato came from South America, and the noodle from China. So, so those darn Italians,
these things were brought to those places too through international trade. Same with spices. Like, food was pretty dang bland in Europe until they got Marco Polo and start bringing stuff back. So I mean,
centuries and centuries and centuries, and same thing. Even there's multiple indigenous peoples in North America who existed prior to European contact. They evolved. They had cultures that changed. So the whole world over.
They weren't very nice to each other either.
A lot of them
it wasn't like they were all just living in like perfect harmony until the Europeans showed up.
Well, and not to mention the Europeans, right? Were tribes just like they were, right? Like, like people think of Europe as Europeans as this one massive people, but the fact is, like, how many tribes were there hundreds and hundreds of years ago, right? Where I was reading about the what's her name? And I'm going to pronounce it wrong. Boudica or Boudicca, I think, are the two ways. The Iceni queen. She was a British tribal leader who went to war against the Romans, and she was she was cool. Really interesting story, history that I was just reading recently, and that was like almost 2,000 years ago. So like there's the Britons, the Gauls, the Celts, the different, and then the Slavic tribes. So there's tribes around the world. There's peoples around the world. And so cultures today have, so much of it has evolved. And you look at America, right? Or Britain to a large degree, and Canada as well, as America's hat. I think you were joking around earlier. But these are multicultural societies.
Yeah. Or at least we were.
Well, they're with their own national identities and their own cultures, and cultures within, right? Because within the United States, there's different cultures too, right? Like the Texans versus someone from New Jersey, or versus someone from San Francisco, or even within neighborhoods, there's different vibes, right? So forget skin color, right? There could be different vibes between different neighborhoods.
But I feel like that's what you're pointing out in your answer to the question is another thing that we seem to understand or take for granted or had a better perspective on, which was the melting pot in general. That not only are all these cultural, the artistic forms, whatever, derivative of each other, and that's a good thing because then they're still living, but that the melting pot, the plurality of the United States is its strength. Yeah. And I feel like what's happening today in schools is like it's like a paradox. You've got, on the one hand, they're saying, we have to be mindful of all the different cultures and languages and heritages, whatever, but in a tribal way, like break off. And as you said, sequester yourselves and be like, you're here and don't you appropriate anything they do. While at the same time, they're trying to homogenize us in terms of what we value, what we think is important, what we're allowed to talk about, what we're not allowed to talk about, what humor is, what's acceptable behavior, which is basically anything that is not remotely normative. Okay, if you do anything normative, that's not acceptable. That's oppressive. That's white supremacist. But that they're trying to like homogenize us in this very awkward, inorganic, top-down way, while at the same time making us almost primitively tribal from the bottom up.
Well, it's this, right?
It's weird.
Cultural, it's weird, and it feels like almost like there's a cognitive dissonance to the whole thing. I mean, the cultural competence or cultural competency, right? Which is a lot of the educator activists like to pride themselves on this, and to me, it's like, great. Basically, you're trafficking in stereotypes, right?
100%.
They basically like treat people in the stereotypical, prejudiced way, right? Right? It's such garbage, because of the assumptions they're making about somebody's cultural background based on how they look or whatever. But then they want everybody reciting the same talking points, the approved talking points of the whatever the political program is, right? They don't want people to be organic. They don't want culture to occur naturally. They don't want someone to make their own idea or come up with their own. No. You have to express the culture you have to sing the song of your people only. And when you're not singing the song of your people, whether it's then you have to conform to the following, I want to say almost like tenets, right? It's almost like dogma, right? And doctrine and dogma, and you're going to speak a certain way, and you're going to behave a certain way, and you're not going to color outside the lines, and you're not going to think for yourself, and you're not going to question any of it, because if you question it, then you're against it, and that's a big issue. It's like, well, no, we should be encouraging kids to ask questions, to question the orthodoxy, to question the and yes, I understand teachers have to maintain some sense of decorum in the classroom, but if they weren't teaching ideology, right? If they were actually just teaching math and teaching actual history rather than an activist version of history, then the kids maybe wouldn't be asking such annoying questions, right? But at this
Well, I
point, I
just
think the
think they
parents
didn't
need
teach
to.
us this. We were taught the subjects. We
Yeah.
were not taught the social mores in school. We had
No,
health
that was
class,
your
we had
parents
sex
too.
ed class, but they left it up to parents. And then, like you said, like I said, actually, we didn't really have parents that much doing it, but we did have our entertainers. We did have our friends. We learned it from, we learned what we could from our parents, our grandparents, etc. We kind of cobbled it together, but we still figured it out. And I think, when they say today, like, well, some people don't have attentive parents to do this, I'm like, you know what? I'll tell you what, I still think it's better. I really do. I think it's better to learn from life, to learn
Yeah.
from trial and error, to learn from your friends, to learn from your neighbors, to learn from just people out and about and living life, because that's what you're going to do. When you get out of school, you're going to have to go live life amongst the people. Okay. And I
Yeah.
still think it's preferable, even if it's imperfect, if it's halting, if you miss out on some chunks of info or whatever, which, by the way, I think you'd miss out on less if they taught you the rudimentary skills of reading and research and critical thinking in school. You'd probably miss out on less out there in the world, but
Yeah.
but instead of that, they think they need to direct instruct the kids in everything they need to learn to be a grown-up adult. And they're forgetting that the things you need to learn to be a grown-up adult in school, that are well learned in school, are reading and math and all that stuff. I don't think you can direct instruct life.
Well,
I
that's
just
it, right?
don't. I don't think you can.
You can't instill character into people. They have to build it for themselves by figuring it out, right? So schools need to be teaching the subjects. They need to be teaching information. And I think what needs to be is kids, to some degree, I think maybe they're overdoing it. Maybe they felt neglected, so they feel like they need to make up for that, and now they're over indoctrinating kids. And to some degree, I think, yeah, have the resources there, be supportive, whatever. But to some degree, I think they need to let them figure themselves out, let them
Yes.
make mistakes, let them screw up, let them learn, and don't what do you call it? Don't condemn them for life for being a jerk in the 8th grade. Like,
Oh my
like
God. Weren't
kids
we
are
all?
horrible. Kids are horrible to each other, to their
Yep.
teachers, to their parents, even, because there's a reason they don't vote, because they're crazy. I'm sorry, people don't like that word, but they're hormonal maniacs at that age, and from one minute they'll be perfectly fine, the next minute they're screaming about something because their whole world just crumbled, just fell apart because you shut off the Wi-Fi, like, right?
They
Right,
don't,
like,
and they don't need adults in school telling, like, reinforcing all this negative stuff. Like, if
no.
there's one thing I took away from most of my teachers, it
Yeah.
was kind of that the only way I was going to be successful in their class was to shut off the part of my teenage brain that was filled with angst. And that may be easier for some than others. Now, that, I mean,
Sure.
like you said, it's good to have resources. Some kids can't shut it off. Some kids have real
Yeah.
chaos at home, like real
Yeah.
problems.
Yeah.
Okay. And you should have those resources there, to help them or whatever. But for the average kid who has average teenage angst, and mine was probably more than average, but even so, the lesson of get out of your head and into the world was actually more therapeutic, more constructive than anything like the guidance counselor was going to tell me. The guidance counselor couldn't fix my mom, or couldn't fix my home life, and couldn't fix
Yeah.
all that chaos and weirdness. But it really helped to have people say, like, let's talk about this now. And we're going to get out of your head. And what I feel like they're doing is they're having the kids spend a lot of time, like, hang out and swim around in your angst, and
Yeah.
document and journal your angst all the time. And I actually think that's really dangerous.
Well, I think it just generates more angst in a lot of cases, right? And
Yeah,
so
for
it
sure.
self-perpetuates. And of course, thus now we're going to need a whole team of school psychologists. And
Social
so,
workers, don't
right?
forget.
So there's a
And
certain
we're going to
amount
need
of
doctors and
self-interest.
psychologists.
I think there's a little bit of that going on too, right?
A lot. A lot.
So
All
healthy
right.
skepticism, and I think, like what we talked about, just, I know we're wrapping it up, but that I think parents, I think we talked about this yesterday, is that parents need to really start taking an interest in what is being put into their kids' heads these days. And,
Yep. Yep.
um,
And if you
and
can't be the kind of parent that, you didn't have, I mean, I'm sympathetic. Like, it's hard even for me. Like,
mhm.
how do you parent when you had no, like, real model for yourself? At least be the parent that is tuned in to the fact that you are the parent. In other words, the school is not the parent. And you may have gotten something out of health class, or you may have gotten a lot of information from your friends or whatever. But there's just more bits of information firing at your kid.
Mm-hmm.
And they need you. They need you to dial in and, tune in, and not just put it on autopilot and let the school do it for you or whatever, because the chances are the school's going to get it wrong. They don't know your kid.
Or
To
some
them, your kid's a
teacher.
number.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And or the teacher's got a crazy view of the world or whatever, right?
Whatever.
Yeah,
maybe you do too, but hopefully you love your child, and that's up to you. But
well,
I just
you hope that they can learn, and if their teachers aren't teaching it, then maybe parents need to think about this, is to teach their kids to think for themselves, right? Critical thinking, right? Like they say, teachers should teach kids not what is it? They should teach them how to think, not what to think.
exactly,
And
yeah.
and I think that that maybe isn't quite clear what that means.
Right.
It isn't what to think or how to think. It's how to think critically and how to question things, and how to navigate the world where a lot of people have different views, different ideologies, different perspectives, and different agendas. So you, not to insult them, not to say that they're all wrong or that they all mean you harm, but that they are coming from different perspectives. And I think kids need to know that they can question those things for themselves.
Yeah, and the only thing that should be safe to do, talk about safe. It should be safe to ask questions that nobody else asks. It should be safe to challenge what everyone else appears to think. And I think the one thing it's absolutely not safe to do right now in school is to be different in your thought process. And, in terms of stepping outside the ideology is very, very unsafe right now. You can dye your hair whatever color you want. You can be 75 genders, but you can't challenge the status quo when it comes to worldview.
You can't
That's
even question
not allowed.
Forget challenging it. You can't even question it. No,
you can't even question it. It's like whatever they tell you in school, that is so, and anything else is bad.
And that's not just true in schools. That's true right now in a lot of workplaces, and on social media. And I don't know, like Netflix just finally caught a piece of this. I think it was the other day they announced about how I think we talked about this earlier, how people are going to have to work on content that they don't necessarily agree with politically.
They remembered they had an audience that was more diverse than their workforce, than
their woke force.
Right. If you want to keep those audiences, and now the schools are saying, oh, parents are this, but it's like, I hate to break it to you, but you don't teach a homogenous group of people. You keep talking about diversity, but you actually don't understand what diversity is. You're teaching the children of a diverse population of thoughts and opinions. And you don't get to decide what all the opinions should be, even if everybody looks different. If we look like that ABC after school special where, they had like the black kid, the brown kid, the Asian kid, the white kid, the girl, the boy, they had one of everything. And that was the after school special.
Well, and I think part of that is that I think a lot of people believe that's the world, when the reality is among those kids, right? Our Crayola box, right? There are so many actual cultures and ethnicities, right? So when you engage in colorism, I think is the actual name for it, and it's kind of racism.
It is
where you treat people by skin color, and you erase their cultural heritage of their families. So it's, again, it goes back to this what educators call this cultural competency, and it's stereotyping. It's just lazy. And really the best way around it is, and I think parents, kids, teachers, coworkers, employers, just everyone really needs to get back to what the ideology or the ideal of our generation was, which was which we thought finally, where we could start treating each other as individual human beings with interesting stories, family histories, backgrounds, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and all that. And finding that interesting about each other, and then figuring ourselves out from there, rather than what I like to call these lazy labels, right?
Yep, they are lazy.
They're substituting for having a personality, right? And it sucks. So I hope. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, so I feel like it's time for our generation to represent. We need to
Yeah,
step up to
yeah.
the plate, and we need to
Well,
remind people.
those are our values, and I think those are actually good values that are in horribly neglected right now.
Right.
It would be nice to see some of that sort of treating other people as human beings, as individuals first,
Yep.
and not engaging in a lot of this sort of rhetoric, this identity nonsense.
Yeah.
I mean, frankly, I think somebody's labels, whatever identity groups they belong to, are probably the least interesting things about them.
100%.
Yeah.
I've said
So
that so many
hopefully,
times. Like,
yeah,
it's just, I don't even walk around going, I'm a woman. Like I just don't even, I mean, I
yeah,
know that I am, but I
yeah.
don't, it
It's
is
not something you
just
think
not the
about, right?
first thing I think about when I think about myself.
I'm
Definitely don't
womaning,
think,
walking
I
around
just,
womaning.
yeah, I don't think about it. I
No,
can't imagine being stuck in that. And I
yeah,
don't think that's a good thing to teach kids either. Like you are not your body. You're your mind. Your mind
yeah,
is what you are.
yeah.
And I really wish we could get back to teaching kids that's the most
Everyone,
important thing.
everyone
Develop
has
that.
they have a name. Everyone has a name. Start there, right?
Exactly.
You
Exactly.
know,
So
the more aware we are, the more we talk about things. Hopefully, it can lead to people like I know your listeners and viewers. A lot of them are parents that they can maybe start noticing or taking more of an account of a lot of these things and maybe getting
right.
involved directly, because I think that's really what has to happen with a lot of this stuff, to say,
Yeah.
look, hey, there's a line here. There's certain things that are appropriate and certain things that are not, and some things are up to the parents to teach, and maybe let the kids figure themselves out a little bit too.
Right.
And that's
Exactly.
that's one of the things I think everybody kind of forgets a little bit, because we just want to make sure everybody's safe, right? That everything's good, and
Yeah. Well, we can't keep everyone safe. I
we,
think there's something to be said for a little stress.
well, they can't learn. They can't learn to swim on their own, to pedal on their own, right? Like eventually you have to take your hand off that bicycle seat and let them pedal on their own, or take off those training wheels. And I think that's part of what's missing with this sort of
Yep.
safetyism of today's culture is,
Exactly.
and we see it, people aren't really growing up.
Exactly.
They're becoming
Exactly.
big baby adults, right? Well,
Big baby adults. I think that's a good place to end it.
all right.
But
Well,
thank you so much. And
cool.
thanks everybody for listening and watching. And we will see you next time.